So let's take a second look at the big core rules balance changes in Warhammer 40k, what do people like and dislike, and what are going to cause the biggest impacts on the game as a whole. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today as we're still reeling from the fallout of 40k's latest balanced data slate, I thought it might be worth a second look at the core rules changes, a few fairly choice but impactful shake-ups to 10th edition as a whole, and which ones are looking most popular with the player base or are going to have the most impacts on the game going forward. As we've been talking about in the last few videos, really quite a lot changed in this update. There were massive points changes to virtually every single faction, big whacks of things going up and down in massive ways, some faction-specific rules changes that targeted one specific thing or another, or occasionally gave army-wide buffs or nerfs, and perhaps one of the most impactful things for going forward in Warhammer 40k were several core rules changes to things like devastating wounds, free stratagems, Overwatch, towering and more. In this video I thought we'd go through those core rules, talk a little bit more as to how they might impact the game going forward, and combine that with a rough popularity poll that I've asked people to vote on over the last 24 hours or so. Which are the changes that you like or dislike the most and why? Starting out, we've got that change to devastating wounds. Previously in 40k 10th edition, devastating wounds meant that if you got a critical wound, then the damage would just directly translate to mortal wounds. It basically meant that you got one mortal wound for a damage characteristic 1 weapon going to a dev wound, but it means that if, say, you had a big anti-tank weapon with damage d6, if that has devastating wounds and then you look out and roll a 6 against the enemy, it'll trigger d6 mortal wounds and therefore kill d6 1 wound models, basically having a bit of a splash effect to kill multiple units or units with odd numbers of wounds left on individual miniatures. After the update though, they basically changed that from being mortal wounds to just being hits that ignore armor and invulnerable saves. This kind of feels like mortal wounds light. Mortal wounds do ignore armor and invulnerable saves, and they do have the same feature of still being able to take feel no pain type saves against them. But besides a few mortal wound defensive type rules, the main difference is that they won't splash to multiple units. If you hit something with a big multi-damage devastating wound attack, you won't be wiping out entire squads of units with one lucky shot. For your rating, this one generally went over pretty popularly. It was voted a big 8 out of 10 out of the channel votes, one of the most popular of the new changes. I think just in general there's a good sense that anti-tank weapons should be good at killing tanks and shouldn't arbitrarily get better at killing squads like this just because you've rolled one lucky dice roll. And of course, as with a few things in this balanced data slate, it was kind of particularly targeted at Eldari, able to plug in automatic 6s for their fate dice, and then make things like wraith cannons or D-cannon support weapons go into rage mode and just blitz through entire units regardless of what they were. At the same time though, I do feel like it's a bit of a strange mechanic. Devastating wounds were perhaps the most common way that you got mortal wounds in 10th edition 40k before this, so it's now maybe a little bit more common that you're going to get these sort of half mortal wounds than actual mortal wounds out and about in the meta. Just maybe seems a little bit weird from a game design point of view. And as mentioned already as well, it's perhaps particularly weird for all the armies that had good mortal wound defense. It's particularly a thing for the Adeptus Custodes with their full faction 4+ save against mortal wounds with a feel no pain type save. That rule basically got drastically toned down. It's going to be useful against other random rules that give you mortal wounds in one way or another, but as mentioned, devastating wounds basically were the most common source of that, so that rule is just massively toned down compared with what it was. There are plenty of other units out there that have had an ability hit due to that, things like the Norn Emissary, the Dark Angels Deathwing with their Watchers, Space Marine Terminator Chaplains, or Lionel Johnson. There are a fair few units out there that have specific mortal wound defense. I feel like for most of these, it's not the absolute end of the world. Devastating wounds are at least fairly common, but perhaps not so much so that it's going to make these units completely unplayable. I think it is really quite a big impact for the Custodes though, who are going to be quite a lot easier to kill with all manner of devastating wounds weapons. Overall though, broadly people seem to think it's a good change. Next up, we've got the stratagem shenanigans that are being changed around. Before the update, captains and their equivalents like overlords or hive tyrants in other armies could use basically any stratagems targeting their units or ones nearby for free. You'd often get either one free per battle round or one free per turn. It was also usually accompanied by a rule allowing you to double up on multiple stratagems as well. So say for example, the Necron Overlord could use their reactive reanimation stratagem on their unit, even if that had been used elsewhere in the army already this phase. Some things also modified stratagems in a negative kind of way as well, things like the Swarm Lord or the Calidus Assassin amongst several others. They've got an ability where you basically take the stratagem and make it one command point worse if the enemy does go on to combat that stratagem and use it a second time later in the battle. The big change for this one is that now for both of these, both positive and negative modifications of the stratagems and abilities that allow you to use 2 in one phase, all of that's only allowed to be used on battle tactics stratagems now. A perhaps slightly arbitrary subclass of stratagems that often had keywords at the top of the stratagem page underneath the title of it. So far in 10th edition, these little keywords have basically had little to no impact whatsoever on the game, but now whether or not a stratagem is a battle tactic or not is going to have an absolutely huge impact on these abilities. It does seem that out of the changes, this change looks like the single least popular out of any of them. You guys only voted it a 5 out of 10. I feel like perhaps while a lot of these characters were very good, they were generally quite feels-good mechanics and maybe felt kind of limited because you could only have one of them per army and have it be efficient. And while I'd say that the mechanic was really quite a bold one for 10th edition, allowing you access to a whole bunch of options for limited CP, it was quite a good one for having a bit of flexibility and really having good variations as to how you play it. Now though, options are just going to be enormously more limited. The command reroll and go to ground are the only core battle tactics stratagems. I'm a little bit uncertain as to whether the command reroll can even be used with these rules. I think it technically targets a dice roll and doesn't actually target the unit, so that might not technically work rules as written. Feel free to let me know your thoughts on that down in the comments below. For generic stratagems, things like the grenade stratagem or the smoke stratagem have been lost, and perhaps one of the most impactful ones is that losing free Overwatch is going to be a big thing. That could be a very reliable way to get a bit of extra damage out of one of these rules turn on turn. For impacts on people's armies, it means that things like captains, hive tyrants and overlords and their equivalents in other armies all took a really big hit to their flexibility. They're now very dependent on exactly what battle tactics stratagems happen to be in their detachment, either the core one from the index, or if you've got a codex yet like Tyranids, which ones are present in each detachment. If I get round to it, it might be worth a video breaking down every single battle tactics stratagem for each of the options. It really is going to vary a fair bit from codex to codex. For example, Space Marines I think are going to be making quite good use of Armour of Contempt with this. The Tyranids one with their invasion fleets does have their 5+ Feel No Pain available, so that's quite good for them. The Necrons are maybe a bit more limited though. It's either going to be a bonus to melee or their reroll wounds at shooting, but they can't use that reactive reanimation thing, which Overlords often quite likes to. I had seen it mentioned as well that some of the weaker factions in 40k perhaps were partly weak because they didn't have good options for this. Armies like Leagues of Votann, Tau, Admech and Death Guard didn't have quite as many options for free stratagems compared with others, or at least not as you want to play them as much, and that might be one of the things that was partly helping keep them behind. Overall though, it's definitely a nerf to those units, and it's certainly a nerf to things like the Kaladesh Assassin and the Tyranid Swarmlord, and the other abilities like the Deathwatch Watchmaster that could make stratagems worse. The stratagems that they have the choice to make worse are just a lot more limited now. Next up, we've got the change to Insane Bravery. Previously, this one command point stratagem was really quite an easy counter to Battle Shock, perhaps surprisingly powerful compared with the 9th edition version of the stratagem, where basically you could wait to see whether or not one of your units fails Battle Shock, then spend 1 CP just to cancel it if it didn't agree with you. It was limited to only being used for actual more natural Battle Shock, so Battle Shock tests that happen in the command phase and the Battle Shock step of it, so it didn't work against some other funky abilities like say Tyranid Shadow in the Warp or Enemy Turn Battle Shock. I think you could certainly argue that it made Battle Shock a little bit weak as a mechanic though, as basically Battle Shock happens in the command phase just after you've generated a CP, so you're usually going to have one spare to mitigate it if you want to. Now though, in this update though, it's been nerfed twice. First up, you have to commit to it before you take the test, and the stratagem can only be used once per game, no more than that, so it's not something that you can fall back on turn. Popularity wise, this one again seems to be one of the more popular changes. You guys rated a 7 out of 10 overall, broadly good. I must say I think I agree with that. It definitely means that the stratagem's a lot less good, but given that Battle Shock maybe has sort of limited impact already, I feel like having it be a little bit more impactful is never really going to be a bad thing. I suppose it might make the game just a little bit more random, with really quite big swings for the positive or negative depending on whether you pass or fail a key Battle Shock test, a little bit less player agency to mitigate one that's truly important. Though on the other hand, it does mean that you might need to be a little bit more intelligent about mitigating the risk, say having multiple units touching objectives and things, and choosing when is going to be the most impactful thing for the Insane Bravery to be used once per game. I say the change still doesn't make the out-of-phase Battle Shock tests any stronger though. Things like the Screamer Killer Carnifex's debuff, I still feel like a lot of those things seem quite weak. Next up, we've got the 2 changes to Overwatch. Definitely one of the most powerful stratagems so far in 10th edition, Basically out of phase shooting, even hitting on a 6+ is really big. It's got the potential to just wipe out units that are going for objectives or take big chunks out of scary enemy fragile damage dealers before they get to strike, and it's often one that tended to come up pretty regularly in games day to day. There's lots of situations where you might have wanted to use it to either stop an enemy scoring an objective or take down a really opportune target. Now though, it's had two main changes to the stratagem itself. First up, you can't use it unless you have line of sight to the target, so it means that you can't approach an artillery thing and then just the artillery just suddenly bombards you from 24 inches away, even if you can't be seen at all. Titanic units can't use it at all, and as mentioned with the previous change, I guess it falls under the free stratagems change as well, so you can't get it reactively with a free stratagem from a captain or something. I thought given that the changes here were really quite different, I thought it was worth breaking it down into two different votes. Broadly speaking, people are very happy with not being able to use it out of line of sight. That had the most approval out of any of these changes with a big 9 out of 10, though the change for Titanic units was far more mixed. It was definitely one of the least popular changes overall, only being voted 6 out of 10, though I did notice with the breakdown of the votes it was very divisive, some people absolutely rating it completely bottom, some people rating it right at the top and absolutely loving it. For the two changes, I did feel that being overwatched by artillery within 24 inches did feel a bit weird to me. I guess you could justify it in headcanon as artillery laying down a bit of a saturation bombardment for the enemy to walk into, but the fact that you could only do that at 24 inches did feel a bit strange to me. I think you more imagine the really big guns to be firing things that aren't just 24 inches away on the board. It was perhaps particularly powerful for Eldari D cannons that had enormous amounts of threat, could dial in automatic hits with the fate dice that they have, and also their range synced up quite well with Overwatch range. They only strike at 24 inches anyway. I did feel like it might have been a bit of an oversight when they released the stratagem, but anyway, it is a thing of the past. If you've got units out of line of sight, they're not getting overwatched anymore, even if your opponent's got some artillery nearby. I must admit, I do think that losing the Overwatch altogether on Titanic units does seem a little bit harsh. Admittedly, it was almost always going to be one of the strongest ways to use Overwatch on a really big Titanic shooting unit, maybe something like a Knight Crusader, or particularly anything with big flamethrowers like a Knight Valiant or Knight Acheron. I think for most armies they maybe won't feel too much of a difference with that, but certainly for Imperial or Chaos Knights that's going to be a big blow to their big boys. I think overall I might have preferred a change where you perhaps just paid more for the privilege of Overwatch if you're going to do it with one of these really big bad threatening units. Maybe spending 2 CP for Titanic units might have been kind of balanced. That way you're not just denying a whole bunch of knights the option to 100% Overwatch, but it would cost you other options down the road in the game. In general though, Games Workshop don't seem to like making variable cost stratagems in 10th edition. It does seem to be something that they've gone against, so I guess that's why we didn't get that. A little bit of a blow to Titanic units in general, particularly things like the Valiant, I feel. Finally, with the major core rules changes, we've got the rules visibility versus towering units change. This one has been on a bit of a saga. In 9th edition, Titanic units could often be seen but not shoot enemies on the other side of ruins, so you could be shot but not shoot back. In 10th edition, towering changed it around, so if you were towering you could both shoot and be shot over ruins. But the way that Games Workshop had written a rule meant that if you were playing on a table with kind of porous terrain with a bunch of windows, or just a lot of holes in the terrain pieces, then you might struggle to hide virtually anything in an army for an Imperial Knights list. You could have situations where the Knights could basically draw a line of sight to just about anything on the table if you didn't have ruins with solid walls. And that's kind of a problem for massive shooting alpha strikes in 40k. You don't really want just one army to line up all its guns and blow the other army off the table just because they couldn't hide anything. Now though, Games Workshop do seem to have fixed that, but in a way that kind of stops towering being much of a thing. The towering rule basically doesn't really apply to very much with terrain anymore. It's literally only relevant if towering units get partly within a terrain piece, and then if they do go partly within a terrain piece, they're able to fire out of that terrain and ignore the obscuring ruin rule. If you do that with a non-towering unit like a tank or something, then technically they'd be within the ruin and they'd be able to be shot from the other side of it, but not shoot out of it. It still is at least kind of powerful. Just nosing into a ruined terrain piece to get line of sight across it does mean that you might have a bit more scope for shooting knights moving up and negating a terrain piece that your opponent can't hide behind now. Overall, this one was broadly positively received, voted a 7 out of 10 by you guys. I think personally I do quite like the way that they have fixed the porous terrain weirdness. I think that did need to happen, given that basically tournaments the world over seem to be house ruling their terrain to not have windows in it if you're turning up to events, just because of how messed up it made these rules. So I feel like Games Workshop really did need to address it in one way or another. It was more of a question of how they did. It does mean though that the towering keyword is just kind of super weak now. It just doesn't really do very much at all. Knights and other towering things are now able to essentially hide behind ruins, provided you've got one that's big enough to not be able to draw line of sight to any part of their model without going over it. And broadly speaking, I'd say it's usually going to be a bit of a nerf to towering shooting units, as they probably cared more about having line of sight than having it drawn to them, but a bit of a buff to towering melee units. They weren't using the shooting advantages anyway, and the towering rule just meant that they could get shot from basically anywhere on the board, which wasn't really in the best advantages to them. Overall, I think it's kind of fine though. Even shooting towering units might actually be able to use the ability to hide sometimes. That could actually be helpful. Though on some big models it's definitely still going to be hard to do that just due to the massive profile that they have. Overall, not the worst change, though maybe a little bit unexpected to kind of soft remove one of the rules from the game. It'll be interesting to hear what you think about it down in the comments. Overall though, it looks like these core rules changes have broadly been pretty positively received. The one that seems to cause the most consternation is the Captain, Overlord and Free Stratagems one. I do kind of think that might have been one they could have just addressed with points and made them a little bit more niche if they thought the stratagem shenanigans were too powerful. Otherwise though, most of the rest seems kind of sensible. I might have liked 2 CP for Titanic Overwatch, but I think that most of the rest, including the insane Bravery change, are probably good for the game as a whole. Look forward to hearing your ideas though down in the comments below. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, but I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that the channel does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these videos coming quite as regularly as they do. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.